guys ready here? We'll take a look at some stuff. Hopefully this is recording. It doesn't really, it tells me it's recording. I don't know if it's recording my volume, so I'm hoping that it is. We'll find out. I'm going to go ahead and have a seat. The first thing that you guys probably want me to do is process the round and see how everybody did. So I will start there. And I know this isn't all that visible. As soon as I'm done processing the round, then you guys can obviously open it up and then be looking at the same things, because what we'll end up looking at, we'll spend a lot of time looking at the capstone courier, okay, for the round. And that's what we'll do today. We'll just kind of go through this first round, talk about it, talk a little bit about how you guys did. If your team didn't do so well, please try to get a little bit of a thick skin. I'll try not to be real picky or anything, but I will point out maybe things that could have been done differently or maybe should not have been done and things like that. So I'm not trying to pick on anybody in particular, but I will point out some things that may have been mistakes. I'll point them out overall too, okay? There's going to be things I'm sure that the class has done as a whole that, could stand improvement. So we'll see. Okay, this is what I'll do. In the future, I will probably do this ahead of time. I'll probably get here or even do it at home or something after 9 o'clock on Monday. Last night, in fact, I was sitting there, I got home, and I thought, I could process that round. It doesn't take me that long to actually process the round. It takes a little bit of time to take the results and put them into my spreadsheet to determine who the winner was, okay? But that's not too big of a deal. But usually I would do that here. That's kind of a pain for me to do at home because the spreadsheet resides on our cloud here at the college. So I'd probably wait. But I might do that even before class in the future on Tuesdays. So then I'd show up and we'll just jump right into kind of analyzing the round a little bit. So after this, then today or tomorrow, I'll make up some questions regarding the round. Probably just 3 or 4 questions, but they're going to force you to go back and look at the courier, probably to come up with some answers. And I hope to, I'll try to design the questions so they're similar to what you guys are going to have at the Comp XM towards the end of class, and then also start them a little bit easier, and by the end of this semester, have some questions that'll be a little bit more difficult. You'll be doing some math, you'll be doing some, returns on and some things like that, and, some hypothetical questions and whatnot. So you don't. That doesn't mean you're not going to do the Comp XM. Okay? Question up here was, did we need to buy the Comp XM? And no, you've actually already paid for that. There's a fee associated with this class, and that pays for the Comp XM. So it's a long story kind of why it's set up that way. We used to use it, I'll tell the story as quickly as I can, but we used to use a different test that was kind of an assessment for us. And so we had a fee in place so that we could purchase that test. It was separate. And then when we decided to start using the Comp XM, I was still charging the fee. And that's why you're buying just the game and you don't buy the Comp XM when you get it at the bookstore, because technically you've already paid for the Comp XM. Does that make sense? Sort of. Okay, so process round. This gives me an idea. I look at this and it says either uploaded or ready. Either one, it doesn't matter. Okay. And it doesn't matter how you guys do. I think you guys get to a point when you're saving your decisions and it says, do you want to tell the instructor that you're done or something like that? And that means that I would get the ready sign. If it just says, no, I just want to upload my decisions and I might come back, then it gives me the uploaded one. It really doesn't matter. Okay. It's kind of the old Yogi Berra saying, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay, and that's kind of what this is. It doesn't matter which one you choose, you're going to get to something that's fine as long as it says one of those 2 things. Okay, then I know that you're ready and I can do it. But I won't do that until the deadline. I'll never process the round until the deadline, even if everybody said ready, because you guys, even if it says ready, you can go back and change your decisions if you want to. Okay, the game will allow you to do that. So This gives me an opportunity to inject cash or do some things like that. I've never done that. Okay, I've never done that. All it does is it increases your debt. If I did that for a team, it's not like I'm giving you money. It's not like I'm giving you a grant. It would just be me increasing your debt. It might save you from an emergency loan, so it could save you some dollars that way, but I've never done that, so you'll live and die upon your own sword, I guess. So then it takes me to this screen, which is the first look that I get at kind of how things went, right? Which team's the computer team, Digby? Okay. So I just glance along. I always kind of look at sales first. Good round so far. I mean, just at first glance, everybody was profitable. That for a first round is outstanding. Okay, I mean that's truly outstanding that every team was profitable. So I'm already kind of giddy a little bit. That's a good start. So okay, sales ranged anywhere from 93, let's say, million. Okay, for Ferris, which was the low. Still not horrible, to the high was only 133. That's not that big of a difference, really, okay, for just getting started. Profits went from pretty close here. Chester and Anders, 10,500,000, and Chester had 10 million, just over 10 million. Cumulative profit I never really look at, so you won't hear me talking about cumulative profit. That's just going to keep adding or detracting depending on what you do in each particular round. Okay. So I don't pay a lot of attention to that because it's kind of a what have you done for me lately? You know, that's the way the real world works, and so that's the way I kind of run it. S&P rating, that can be kind of meaningful. If you remember from finance class, what's a junk bond? Remember what the difference is between a junk bond and investment grade in terms of where the rating's at? Man, how soon we forget. Junk bonds are anything worse than or less than triple B. Okay. Triple B and higher are considered investment grade. So you guys are all junk bonds. Not surprising for a small company. Okay, not surprising at all for a small company. I don't get too, and you probably shouldn't get too hung up on the ratings, and the ratings will show up on a different screen for you guys. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. Okay. Cash. Not too bad. Digby, the computer team, ended up with, I would call that poor cash management. I'd much rather see Ferris had a little emergency loan. To me, that's a little better cash management than having $31 million. Okay.
How does it determine when to kick in the emergency loan?
When you've run out of cash. You can see the cashier's zero, right? And so they ran out of cash, and so emergency loans for both Erie, $6 million, which isn't much, but it's enough to garner a penalty. Sorry, $4.5 million doesn't garner a penalty actually. Okay, I've kind of set an arbitrary limit there, and I thought about changing that, and I might make it a little more pro rata. In other words, it would get a little bit worse at each level of an emergency loan. What question? You guys can't get to the screen. Sorry. But this information, no, pretty soon. As soon as I get it all done, then we'll look at the Capstone Courier. And this is all information that'll be on the Capstone Courier. This just kind of gives me a quick, you know, as I'm going through the process, you can see I still got one more step that I have to go through. But it just kind of gives me a quick look. And so I just kind of running you guys through what I get to look at quickly and the things that are kind of important. You know, I look at that, you know, the revenues, of course, those types of things, the profit, that's fine. Remember, I don't score necessarily on some of those things. Leverage is a big deal. Digby, our computer team, right, 2.47 in terms of leverage, they're going to get dinged for that, okay, because that's a little bit high, a little bit more risk, right? And you know, here's a goofy thing. So they got high leverage and they got 31 million in cash. I'm scratching my head, right? You know, why would you have that much cash and that much leverage? You know, it doesn't make any sense to me in a case like that. So inventory values are relatively low. Okay, Chester only $1.7 million in inventory. Probably had some stock outs. Probably lost out on some money as a result of that. Ferris $29 million. So Ferris struggled a little bit in terms of inventory, getting their inventory out the door. My guess is then And these are the things, again, I look at. I try to catch these things right off the bat, and then I say, oh, my guess is Ferris probably, if you add their sales to their inventory, they're in the same ballpark, right, as these in terms of their total sales. So that means that they did something wrong. They didn't get the sales. They didn't generate the sales that the other teams did, right? So if I'm Ferris, and if I'm the other teams, I'm scratching my head a little bit, and I'm saying, I got to look at what Ferris did wrong. Okay, here I'm already picking on Ferris. Or who's Ferris? Okay, so I'm already picking on you guys a little bit. And, they did something that caused them not to generate the types of sales that we saw from the other teams. Okay, because they produced about the same amount, roughly, give or take $5-10 million. They produced roughly the same amount, but they didn't get the sales out the door. So, okay, ROE, again, a big deal. Chester, look at that. Andrews had more profit. Chester had more ROE. Ooh, what happened? I got to know, right? How do you have less profit but a greater ROE? Can you guys think what the answer to that is right off the top of your head? What is return on equity? I mean, what's the formula? Okay, get used to me reminding you of when anything says return on, that means net income divided by whatever the last thing is. In this case, it's equity, right? We've got return on assets, so that's net income divided by assets. We've got return on, or ROS, which is return on sales, so that's net income divided by sales. Okay, so if return on equity is net income divided by equity, and Andrews had higher net income, what could have made Chester's return on equity higher? There's only two things in that equation, right? There's net income and there is equity.
So they had less equity.
They'd had a little less equity.
They didn't take out as much debt.
It doesn't have anything to do with the debt. I'll bet that Team Andrews, this is just a bet right now, okay, but making an assumption here, that Team Andrews issued a little stock and Team Chester did not. That's just my guess at this point in time. We'll see quickly here, okay? Earnings per share then, 2, and this kind of confirms maybe what I just said. Chester had $5 and Andrews only $4.64, okay? And yet Andrews had more profit. So how could that be? Well, what's earnings per share? Earnings per share is exactly what it says it is. It's the amount of earnings that you have divided by the number of shares outstanding. Andrews had more earnings. Okay, how did Chester have higher earnings per share? Andrews issued stock. Okay, pretty well confirms it. It'll be on the Courier. We'll look at that when I get there. But I can tell you right now that I can't think of another scenario. Unless Chester bought back stock, that could be a scenario. Andrews didn't issue any, but Chester actually started buying back stock right away. First round, it's possible. Okay, so it could be one of those two things, but that's really about it. Okay, so we'll continue on. On this screen, next screen doesn't really tell me anything. It's fun, I kind of get these. They tell me how the teams are doing. This is compared to other schools and people that are competing in other places around the world, okay? I don't put any stock into it, so it's kind of nice to look at, and I say, oh, Andrews and Chester, look at that, they're in the 92 and 89th percentile. But generally speaking, if we have teams that are pretty high, it also means we got teams that are kind of low, right? I'd rather have every team in this class be at the 50th percentile, right? Because that would mean that you're just beating up on each other and you're competing and you're all doing well, right? And doing just fine, okay? Versus, okay, one, having a team that's maybe struggling a little bit or something. So, okay, that's it for the processing. So the round's been processed. Now you guys could go to your Courier, as I will. I'll wait. I'll leave the winner in suspense. How's that? So we'll do that towards the end of class. I'll show you where I go and I get data that I have to copy and paste, and plug into my spreadsheet, and we'll show how that works out. It's not always 100% clear. Usually I can kind of tell, you know, this was a pretty close round. I'm not 100% sure who's going to win this round. And sometimes it could be because there could be a discount for working capital, or there could be a discount in there that I didn't see. I didn't see any team but the computer team was going to get a discount for leverage. One team was going to get a discount for emergency loan. Okay, the other one that's out there is working capital, and so I don't know. I'd have to take a look at working capital. So, okay, on mine, I come here where it says industry reports. Your guys's, I think, is different. What's it say where you guys go to for, does it just say reports? Okay. I go to industry results, and then I come to the courier. For you guys, too, the courier is going to give you a synopsis of what all the teams have done. It gives you pretty good information into what your competitors are doing, right? Okay. For each of you, on the other hand, you also have this annual report, and I encourage you to look at it. But the annual report is only for your own team. Okay, so that breaks down some of this information even into a little bit more detail, and it's important to look at. Okay, and you should look at that. Okay, I can click on annual report, and I can look at each of your teams' annual report, but you guys can only look at your own, right? And it's important to look at those things. Okay. But the Capstone Courier, it's going to retain all of them as we go through the practice rounds. It'll retain all 5 rounds, so we'll be able to go back. You'll be able to go back if you want to in round 3 and look at round 0 still if you want to. Okay. When we start the competitive rounds, each competitive round will get rid of one of the practice rounds, if that makes sense. And you probably don't need to go back and look at the practice rounds anyhow. You might want to for some reference or something, but you probably won't need to. So you can either open it up in a PDF or open it up in HTML. I've typically been using HTML, but I might switch here. I'm going to see how these two look. With Windows 10 now, it's not giving me as good a look right here. I've usually been able to expand this, you know, like to 125, but it's being weird. And I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. I'm not able to move this, and so I'm not, and then you guys can't see. And so I'm going to go back and see if I can do this in maybe the PDF. And see if that looks a little bit better. Come on. And obviously the PDF, if you wanted to print it out and put it in a 3-ring binder or something, you certainly could. You're always, like I said, through the practice rounds, you're always going to have access to it. Okay, so I don't see a lot of need in printing it off, but that would be completely up to you guys. I'm reading this end users licensing agreement, and it reminds me of a joke that I just got over the internet. I don't know if it's perhaps a little bit sexist, so maybe avoid telling it. It's not that bad. I don't think it would get me in too much trouble. Okay, let's see. How do I get rid of this over here? I know there's a way to do it, isn't there? This one? To the right of... Oh, this one. Very good, thank you. Very, very good. Yeah, that's a little bit better. That gives me a full screen so you guys can kind of see it up here, but hopefully you're looking at it on your own screen as well. Okay. By the way, if I were making decisions, you know, I'd open up the courier like this in one tab, and then I'd open up another tab and re-log in and keep last round's information available here so I can toggle back and forth between the tabs. You guys, as you're working in teams, you might do it a little different. You might have one person that has the courier opened up, and then the other person, you know, making the decisions over there, and so you can toggle back and forth a little bit easier that way. So, okay. Again, I'll talk to you more about the things that I look at versus the things that I don't. And we could argue, I guess you could argue as to what's important, and you're going to get a heavy dose of the things that I probably think are important when I look at this. And other people might disagree, and that's fine. If you're one of those that disagrees, please bring it up, and we'll certainly talk about it. But ROS isn't one that I spend a lot of time on, return on sales. It early on here, it can be kind of an apples to apples comparison. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. In the end, I've seen wide disparities in return on sales, and that didn't wide disparities, and yet, or let's put it this way, maybe I'll see an equal return on sales, but then huge disparities in return on equity or earnings per share. Okay, and bottom line, I'm kind of interested in return on equity. Return on equity is return on my investment, right? That's the money that I've put into a company if I'm buying an interest in a company. Okay, earnings per share also. Now, earnings per share is also only valid in a game like this where you guys all started out the same. Okay, if I look at earnings per share in the real world, it's totally meaningless. Okay, it's meaningful if I'm comparing Apple today versus Apple 2 years ago. That's very meaningful. It's totally meaningless if I compare Apple today to Microsoft today, because I don't know how many shares are outstanding, right? And so it's completely a whole different thing. The only reason that this is valid, and the only reason I use it in my scoring system, just so you guys know, is because you guys all start out with the same number of shares, and you do have the ability to change, you know, those number of shares that are outstanding and whatnot. Okay, and so it becomes a valid comparison here. It's not valid in the real world. Okay. Asset turnover. Now that just tells us how your sales are compared to total assets. Yeah. You want that number to be higher. Okay. You know, I'm not saying that this is either good or bad here, but you want to push that number to be higher. Early on, this is probably okay. ROA. Again, this is something that can be a little bit deceiving, and it's why I don't really score on ROA. If when I was in banking, ROA was a number that we threw around often. Okay, it was an easy comparison from one bank to the next, and it wasn't apples to apples comparison. Okay, because banks are all structured pretty much the same. There's not a lot of difference between them, and so ROA was pretty easy to make good comparisons from one bank to the next. Not always that way in the real world. Okay, it's not always that way in the real world, and so I don't typically spend a lot of time looking at that. Leverage, I'll glance at. Like I said, Digby's a little bit high. Erie's right up, bumping against it. That's good. Okay, I like leverage. I do in a business sense. I hate leverage in a personal sense. I don't think you should ever borrow money unless it's to make money. Okay, ever. Okay, and so in a business sense, I can see where borrowing money can make some sense. In a personal sense, I'm less inclined to think that way. ROE then is huge, right? So I jump at ROE here and I take it. That's my first look. That's my first idea who might have won this round. Okay. Sales, always got to look at though, okay? Because obviously generating sales is going to be a key component to being victorious here. Okay. Now, if you've got similar sales, you know, then there's obviously some underlying things that also lead to profitability. Okay, and those are very, very important. Okay, but generating sales is a huge thing. You know, we'll talk about that. That'll be some of the questions that I ask you. You know, it might be as simple as, you know, why didn't Ferris? This could be one of your questions. Why didn't Ferris generate more sales? Okay, why were they the low team on the totem pole when it comes to generating sales here? Okay, we don't know yet, because we haven't gone down far enough. But we'll find out as we go down a little bit. Okay, EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, right? We'll spend some time looking at that ultimately, and then looking maybe at the final number and making some comparisons. And that's going to be, we'll get down a little further and we're going to see a more detailed income statement. We're going to see a more detailed cash flow. We're going to see a more detailed income statement. And we're going to see a more detailed balance sheet for all the teams where we can really make some good comparisons. Okay? And up here, this is just a really quick glance, selected financial statistics, quick glance. Okay? Away we go. Now, one of the things that I score on is contribution margin, right? These are all exceptional. Okay, I think the guide tells you that you want to shoot for 30% at least. Okay, and first round, everybody's bumping up against 30%, and a couple of teams are over 30%. Half the teams are over 30%. 29.9, that's effectively 30. 29.8 and 29.2. I mean, there's not much difference there, and so everybody did an exceptional job in pushing contribution margin for the first round. Okay, I will tell you that 30 is not a worthy goal. It is for the first round. Okay, by the end of the competitive rounds, 30 will get you just beat all to hell, is my guess. Okay, so you need to set your goals a little bit higher than that. First round, yeah. This is good. You guys did well. You did exceptionally well. Okay, and for every team to be right up there, that's really good. That's fun to see. Okay. The other thing that we look at is this SG&A to sales. Okay, these two are basically gross profit and then operating profit types of margins. Okay, so they directly relate to if my sales are 100 million. And my contribution margin is 30%, just to give some good rough numbers, I've got a $30 million gross profit. That's what that's telling me, right? Okay. If my sales and general and administrative expenses are 10%, that's 10% of my sales, so that'd be another 10 million. Then all of a sudden my EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, is 20 million, right? So I want my contribution margin to be higher. I wouldn't mind seeing my SG&A to sales margin be lower. Okay. These both have big butts to them, right? Okay. SG&A to sales includes your marketing expenses. Okay. How are you going to generate some sales? One way might be through increased marketing, right? Okay. And so this number might be high if you're trying to generate sales. Okay. The SG&A to sales could be high if you're really, really trying hard. You're spending a lot of money on marketing, doing those types of things. Might be okay. Okay. Especially if your contribution margin is also high. Maybe you're spending a lot of money on marketing and you're keeping your prices up there a little bit, but you're a differentiator and you got all your products out there where they're supposed to be, on and on and on. Okay. That can be okay. Okay. So it's a nice comparison to look at these, and you want. I'll give you an example here. Andrews had a little more sales than Chester, right? Their profits ended up being pretty darn close, within $500,000. Okay, Andrews had the higher contribution margin. That's wonderful. Okay, that's really good. But Andrews also had the higher SG&A to sales, and by 2%, they had nearly a 4% higher deal there. The net difference is 2%, roughly. Okay. So in terms of their margins, Andrews had a 2% better margin. Chester did some other things then to make up. They still did some other things to make up there. Could be in depreciation. It could be in interest. It could be in some other things. We'll see that when we get down to the income statement. That's probably a little more complex question that I might ask a little later in the semester. It would be a question as simple as that. Why did Andrews have a much bigger contribution margin, and yet Chester, came close in terms of profit? Okay, we're gonna have to look at the income statement to answer that probably. I don't spend a lot of time looking at this. You guys might. It just gives us our market share, overall market share. That's fine. Everybody started out 16.7%. If you divided everything up equally, it'd be 16.7%. So if you're above 16.7, you're doing pretty good. If you're below, you're doing not so good, right? Okay. The stock market summary. This is where we learn some things, like I said. Okay. One of the big things I assumed when I saw that first deal that Andrews had sold some stock. Everybody started with 2 million shares. Andrews, Baldwin, Chester all sold some stock. So Chester did sell a little bit of stock, but not nearly as much. Andrews sold a lot of stock. Okay, Andrews sold a lot of stock. So even though Andrews had more profit, they had a lower ROE and they had lower earnings per share because they have more shares outstanding now. They diluted their earnings, is what that's called. Okay, they diluted their earnings because they sold stock. They got more shareholders now, or at least more shares outstanding. Okay, Chester diluted their earnings a little bit, but certainly not to the extent that Andrews did. Okay? And Digby, Erie, and Ferris didn't dilute their earnings at all. And this is, this can be an ongoing thing, right? It's going to be easier now for Digby, Erie, and Ferris to get ROE and to get earnings per share, good ROE and good earnings per share, because they haven't diluted their shareholder base. Okay? Just something to keep in mind. What's cheaper, debt or equity?
Equity, or debt.
You're sitting this close to me,
I'm reading and listening at the same time, and not saying what I meant to.
All right. Okay, so pay attention to that. Now, again, like I said early on, maybe issuing some equity and using it to make huge investments would be smart. We'll see if those kinds of investments got made. Don't know. Okay, stock market summary. We look at this. That's really pretty tight for the first round. Honestly, first rounds, and probably because you guys had a little experience with Kevin's game and whatnot, I'm hoping that that's the case anyhow. But oftentimes in the first round, I'll see 2 or 3 teams that just go zoop right down to $1 because they made a mistake, they goofed up, something happened, they didn't understand something, and then they have to fight back. It's a quick look at this is not a bad thing. It gives you an idea if a team borrowed some money or not. Andrews didn't borrow any money. That's the base. That's what everybody started with. Okay, Baldwin borrowed a whole $100,000. Okay, Chester didn't borrow anything. Digby borrowed $1 million. Erie, $6.1 million, and Ferris $2 million. I like to just glance at that and kind of see what's going on in terms of the debt situation. See what my opponents are doing. Okay, the ratings. Yeah. If I'm triple D, I'm probably worried. If I'm triple A, I'm probably worried the other way a little bit. I'm not sure that having a perfect rating in this game is the best thing, right? For profit, because it probably means you're not using a lot of leverage and stuff. Yeah, so. Next year's prime rate 7.5. That's one thing they need to do with this game. They haven't brought the rates in line with kind of what we're seeing in real life right now. What's the prime rate right now? Any you guys know what prime rate is nationally here in the U.S.?
2.25.
It's a little higher than that. It's about 3.5. Should be about 3.5 right now. 3.25, 3.5. Okay. This financial summary, then, I like to come down and spend a little bit of time on. We start with the cash flow up here. Okay. Cash flow gives me a lot of information about my own team and my opponents that I'm really interested in. Okay, the net income I saw up above, I'm not particularly interested in that. The depreciation I like to take a look at, and that kind of coincides maybe with what happened down here, at least in this round. It gets a little more complicated as we go on to future rounds. But I have a higher depreciation for both Andrews and Erie. Okay. And why is that? I can tell down here that they spent a lot of money. Andrews spent $27.2 million. Erie spent $28.8 million. Okay, so Erie might have had a little bit of an emergency loan because they spent a lot of money. They invested. Spent's a bad word here. Invested is a much better word. They invested a lot of money in some plant improvements. Be interesting. I got to know what it is. Okay, I got to know, and especially if I'm Andrews, I know what it was, right? Okay, so if I'm not Andrews or if I'm not Erie, I got to know. Okay, I got to know what they're spending. They're my competitors. I have to know what they're spending money on. To a lesser extent, Baldwin and Chester and Digby invested money. Ferris invested no money in plant improvements. Okay, so no capacity. What types of investments would happen when I say plant improvements? About 2 things. What two things could they do if they're making plant improvements? You guys that made plant improvements, Andrews. Automation would be one. Capacity would be the other. Really, that's about all you can do for plant improvements. Okay, that's about all you can do. Okay, like we saw up above, and we'll see here in the cash flow too. Then, I'm sorry, I'm kind of skipping over some of these. These would tell me certain stories, right? If, for example, I had a huge negative number in inventory, like I see kind of for Ferris, that tells me that they're down on cash because they didn't sell inventory, basically, right? So they accumulated inventory. They had to pay for the inventory to create it, to build it, to do those types of things, and they didn't sell it, and so that was a net decrease for their cash. Does that make sense? Okay. On the other hand, Andrews had a positive for cash, so they sold more inventory than they produced, actually. Right? They actually sold more inventory than they produced last round because they had some inventory coming in. And so that was a positive to their cash flow, right? And accounts receivable would be similar. Usually we don't spend a ton of time looking at that. I might be interested because Andrews did have a huge increase in accounts receivable. Most of the time, this accounts receivable kind of goes along with your sales, okay? And in this case, I'm looking at Andrews and saying, well, their sales and Chester sales and Digby sales and Baldwin's, they were all fairly close, okay? Andrews did something. I'm not necessarily going to tell you what it is, okay? They did something that increased their accounts receivable above and beyond what other teams' accounts receivables are. That was a negative for their cash, by the way, right? So that created a little bit of a negative for a cash, so they made a decision there, okay? Plant improvements we kind of already talked about. Dividends paid, Digby, is that our computer team? They paid a dividend right off the bat. Interesting. Okay. And they still had $31 million in cash. I'm scratching my head still.
It's cheating.
Yeah, we'll see. Sales of common stock, we saw up above that team sold some common stock, right? And quite a bit for Andrews, a little bit for Baldwin. Chester, they probably, in terms of percentages and stuff, this was probably really a negative thing because there's fees and stuff involved with issuing stock too. There's a cost, a float cost, right? Remember we talked about that in finance class a little bit. There's a flotation cost whenever you issue stock. And so they had to pay that, and they got a whole $400,000 that they could invest, and they've got $19,500,000 in cash. So the $400,000 was meaningless, and yet it cost them to have extra stock outstanding, more shares outstanding, and they had some expenses involved with the issuance of the stock, and on and on and on. Now, in the past, I have actually seen some teams do this, and so please don't do this. I have seen teams buy and sell stock in the same round. Why, I have absolutely no idea, but I have seen teams actually sell and buy back stock in the same round, okay? The only thing you're doing when you do that is you're paying fees, okay? You're enriching somebody else, and it ain't you, okay? Now, will teams sometimes sell stock in early rounds and buy it back in later rounds? Yeah, that's fairly normal. That's not unusual, okay? Cash from long-term debt being issued, so we saw some teams issue some long-term debt, some short-term debt being issued. Erie, or Digby, the computer team, again, here they issued $20 million in short-term debt, or they borrowed $20 million, and they still got $31 million on hand. That kind of gets back to the leverage thing, why their leverage is high. If they got rid of that $20 million and lowered their cash, their leverage position probably would be smaller, probably would be within the reason. And Erie borrowed $5.8 million in short term. Okay, gives us an idea then what the cash was. Okay, not bad. Net change in cash position, then we see down here. Then we come and look at the balance sheet. Again, Erie and Ferris each had emergency loans, so they've got zero cash. Good cash management there. I mean, if you're doing it, having too much cash can be as bad as having not enough cash. Kind of my opinion there a little bit. But you know, I've been complaining a little bit here about the computer team, not really complaining, but saying, God, 31 million in cash. They borrowed 20 million. I'm not sure what the heck they're doing there, right? Okay. You know, that's almost as bad then as having a small emergency loan. Again, I'd almost rather have a $2 million emergency loan than have $31 million in excess cash sitting out there. What are you going to do with it, right? You can invest it next round, but why didn't you invest it this round? You borrowed $20 million. So I'll pick on the computer team. They don't have to have a thick skin, right?
Is it possible, like the computer's thinking that, you know, based on the unit sales forecast, that they needed that kind of that cushion, and they ended up doing better than they planned?
They might have. You know, they might have just been planning to have a big cushion just to make sure they didn't have an emergency loan, right? It's a great what if that you guys can do. And when you're making decisions, I really, really encourage this. You know, when you're on your marketing decisions, the computer creates a sales forecast, right? And then it allows you to put in your own forecast. You guys remember what I'm talking about here when you get into your decisions there? Okay. I think you're crazy if you don't take a look at the computer forecast, maybe make your own forecast and see where you're at financially, see what that does to your cash and everything else, but especially financially. You know, having enough cash at the end of the year is really important. And then go back to that and lower your forecast by, pick a percent, I don't care, maybe it's 10%. You know, 10% is easy, write down, maybe you want to do 20% because by golly, you want a good cushion, okay? So you lower your forecast, that actually changes the numbers then, and then you go back and look and see if you still have cash, if you're still estimating that you would have cash, okay, at the end of the year, if your forecast came in 10% under the numbers, okay? You might be more aggressive in certain segments. You know, maybe you're gambling a little bit in one segment, and so maybe you'll drop that one 20%. You keep the rest of them at your forecast because you feel pretty safe with that. You know, you can mess around and do those types of things. To me, that's the greatest way to do some what ifs and mess around. And then I always go back and look at the financial part. What you forecast there has no impact on anything, right? Other than the numbers that you're kind of forecasting, right? That doesn't affect what your final numbers are going to be. It just gives you that opportunity to do a what if. And so I really, really encourage that. Okay, so cash, we look at accounts receivable. What did I see up above? I saw that Team Andrews had a big decrease in cash because they had a big increase in accounts receivable. And so I would expect their accounts receivable to be substantially higher, and it is, than other teams. Okay, I wonder why. Inventory. Again, I see inventory, and that's consistent with what we saw up above as well. Okay, total current assets. Plant and equipment. Okay, big investment. You can see by, remember we saw this up above too, so this is pretty consistent. Plant and equipment there, plant and equipment there. Okay, so total fixed assets. I would expect that to be bigger, of course, because they invested money in plant and equipment. And then total assets. Accounts payable, pretty consistent, kind of what I would expect. Because again, your accounts payable are going to be based on your production for the most part. And big variances in production might affect your accounts payable. Or you can make some other changes, right? You guys can change how you pay your suppliers. Okay, and it might have some impacts one way or the other, but you can change that. Current debt, what they borrowed, we saw that up above. Long-term debt, if they borrowed any, and we saw that again up above in the bond market summary. So total liabilities, total equity, not terribly of interest in the first round. As the rounds go by, I'm going to spend a lot more time looking at total equity. Okay. And the reason for that is what we first talked about. We talked about return on equity, right? What's the biggest thing that I score on? Return on equity, okay? And so what are the two ways that you can affect your return on equity? There's two figures that go into return on equity, right? Let's rehash this, okay? Net income divided by your equity, okay? So you can increase your income, that gives you a higher return on equity, But what's the opposite? You can reduce your equity. Okay? Oh my God, who would reduce their equity? Why would you want to reduce your equity? Don't you want to build your equity as much as possible? Not necessarily. You're being a steward of investors' money. You want to give the investors the best return you possibly can. When you cease to do that well, you should return cash to your investors. Okay? Now, in this game, it's a rapidly growing business. You've got lots of opportunities to make investments. Lots of opportunities to make investments. So, kind of like Apple, as they've gone through their growth spurt, I wouldn't even dream of giving back cash, and they didn't, until you get to the point where you kind of run out of places to invest your money. Or you got so damn much money that you don't know where to invest it, right? Apple's got $200 billion in cash. You know, what the hell are they going to buy for $200 billion? You know, there's hardly any companies out there even that big, right? Okay, so they can't buy other companies. They're limited as to how much they can invest internally. They're spending a lot of money on research and development. But where are you going to go? You've already invented the newest and greatest iPhone and iPad, and now I guess you're investing on cars. They're going to try to create a self-driving car and on, right? And so you kind of hit a limit there maybe as to where you can invest, and at that point in time, it's a good idea maybe to return cash to investors, which lowers your equity, which increases your return on equity, right? Which I score very, very highly. Okay. On the income statement. Okay. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Mark this down, because I'm going to ask a lot of questions through the semester on your assignments that are going to have to do with maybe contribution margin or different things like that. I'm going to have a lot of you, okay, that erroneously, wrongly put down, geez, their variable costs were higher. Okay? I don't care. Okay? The number here, sort of relevant here in the first round. The total dollar for variable costs becomes totally irrelevant as this goes on. Okay? Because it's all in relation or all relative to the sales. And that's always reflected in the contribution margin. Okay? In other words, Andrews had $133 million in sales. Guess what? Their variable costs are higher than Ferris, and because Ferris only had $93 million in sales, right? So their variable costs are $22 million more. Oh, who cares, right? It's relative to the sales that matters, and that's always reflected in the contribution margin, right? It's the inverse of the contribution margin is the variable cost. Does that make sense? If my if my contribution margin is 30%, my variable costs are 70%. Period. Okay? It's the percent that matters there. It's not the absolute dollar amount. Okay? So almost inevitably, if I give you an assignment and you're writing it down and you're saying, well, geez, they had higher variable costs, probably just mark it wrong. Okay? When you do that. Okay? Hint, hint, as we go along. Okay. Depreciation. I would expect depreciation to be higher for Andrews and Erie because they invested a lot of money in plant, right? You got more money in plant, you got more capacity, you got more, and I don't know which it is yet. We're going to find out. Okay, but you got more automation or you have more capacity, either one, okay, then you have greater depreciation. Okay? So it's a cost. Okay? It's going to affect your bottom line, okay? But it's an investment that you're making that hopefully will pay off in the future. Okay? We'll see. SG&A to sales, again, more important here, again, as it is relative to the sales. So the dollar amount here, it is important. This is one I'm not going to say. It's not quite like the variable cost. This one is important, but the percentage is probably more important. The key here is efficiency. The key here is efficiency. When we get to SG&A to sales, you'll see later on, you'll see the team that has the highest dollar amount of SG&A to sales might have the lowest percentage because they're very, very efficient and effective at generating sales with the money that they're investing in that area. Okay? And so that's the key to your SG&A to sales, is being very, very efficient and effective in generating sales with the money that you spend in that area. Okay? How do you do that? Well, you're spending money in marketing, and that's part of it, but you also have to, there's other ways to generate sales, and that has to most often to do with the customer buying criteria and your ability to reflect or to hit the nail on the head when it comes to that customer buying criteria. Okay, these are going to be fairly meaningless, the other fees, write-offs, and TQM, until we get to TQM. When we start making investments in round 4 in TQM, we'll start seeing this number here maybe change, and maybe change big, depends. EBIT, earnings before interest, taxes. Okay, interest. Okay, here's where Andrews made 1.3 million more. In the end, they only make a couple $100,000 more, and that's because they had more in interest. They had a little more in taxes then too, right? Okay, so that was the big difference there. Why that gap narrowed there a little bit. But every team was profitable. That's huge. Okay. First glance at this. Okay. As a group, you guys are absolutely, unbelievably have way, way, way too much capacity. That's as a whole class. Okay. Way, way, way too much capacity. Okay. The only time I won't say that this semester is when the little gold line is about twice as big as the little blue line for every single team. Okay. Otherwise, I'm going to tell you that you just got way too much capacity. I can glance at this and tell you that. Okay. When the blue lines are longer than the gold lines, you're not even using your first shift. Okay. You're not even using your full first shift. Wow. Okay. So that means that for 60% of the day, your plant's just sitting there idle. You're heating it. You got the maintenance guys going around emptying out the garbages and mopping the floors and doing those types of things. You got the lights on, or the security systems going, security guards wandering around, okay? And you're paying for that. You're also paying a lot in depreciation. You're probably paying a lot in interest, okay? You're paying a lot of money, okay, to leave buildings empty for 60% of the day, okay? You can see Digby, the computer teams, they at least used first full shift. The rest of you guys didn't even use your first full shift. Okay, so you got a lot of buildings just sitting around. Nice to visit, I suppose. We can play basketball in there. If you got good high ceilings and stuff. If you guys aren't using it, we can go play some basketball in there or something. Yeah, Molly says yeah, we'll practice. Volleyball will work too, as long as ceilings are high. Gotta have high ceilings, play a little volleyball. Okay, so I glance at this, and usually I don't spend a ton of time. I mean, this when we come down and look at the capacities and whatnot, it'll be a little bit more meaningful. I think you guys started at 18, 14, 9, 6, and 6. Okay, so when we looked up above, we saw that some teams made some investments, Andrews and Erie especially, but other teams did as well. But I need to know what those investments were in. Okay, 18, 14, 9, 6, 6. So they didn't change their capacity. So Andrews invested some money someplace else, right? Okay, had to be automation. Okay, they spent a lot of money on automation. 5, 6, 5, 5, 4 versus, what'd you start at? 4, 6, 3, 3, 3? Something like that. And I could go back and check. It's a little too fast or a little too slow for me to toggle, and I only have one screen up. But I'd go back to the 0. 4, 5, 3, 3, 3? Okay. Okay, 4, 5, 3, 3, 3. So they bumped each of these up 1, they bumped these up 2, and they bumped that up 1. Okay, in terms of automation. So they invested a lot of money in automation. Okay. Did they have a high contribution margin? They had the highest, didn't they? Okay. I'm gonna jump down to Erie because Erie also spent a lot of money in stuff and improvements. No change here. Again, I think that's what you guys started with, 18.4, 9.66. But and 5.3.3.3 are the same. So Erie threw a ton of money into one category in terms of automation. Okay, huge, a huge amount of money. Jumped that up from, what'd you say it started at, 4? So they went 4 degrees or whatever. They doubled their automation, okay, in that particular segment. So we'll see what that does, especially as the rounds go on. What's that? Yep. For the practice rounds, okay. For the 5 practice rounds, it accumulates, okay. At the end of the 5th practice round, then we go back to 0. Or we go back to everybody starting at the same level. It's not 0, but everybody will start back. We're doing 5 practice rounds. We got 4 left. Sure. I know I got to help you guys with math sometimes. So. You can see if
by the time we start over again, we're pretty good at this.
I'll tell you what usually happens, and it may not this time. You guys may prove to be better, but generally speaking, in the practice rounds, and part of it is because you guys played this game in Kevin's, so you got a little bit better understanding. Generally, what has happened in the past is in the practice rounds, the computer team just dominates, and the student-run teams just stink. They're struggling. But what I always say is student teams learn, and the computer doesn't change. Okay, and generally, then what happens in the competitive rounds is the student teams, or at least some of them, catch up, and I've seen once or twice, this doesn't happen real often, but I've seen the computer team once or twice actually be just like flat busted because the student teams got, and they were all doing well, and so then you had to pick on, you had to get market share from somebody, and it ended up being the computer team, and the computer team ended up just kind of stinking it up. Okay, how this will turn out, I don't know. You guys got off to a really good start. Okay, so you guys may beat the computer team in the practice rounds. Awesome. Okay. And then if you do, then I'll project that the computer team will be suffering in the competitive rounds. That you guys will just pick on it, and I'll get to pick on it, and you guys won't have to have such thick skins because I'll just be able to pick on the computer team as being the bad team, that's making poor decisions and those types of things. So hopefully that's how it turns out. Okay. Glance at these, right? I want to see what the capacities are. These in the early rounds, maybe a little less important. It might help me if I start looking at some of these. It might help me in determining what my competitors are doing. Okay, might help me a little bit in determining what my competitors are doing. What do I mean by that? If I were a niche differentiator, okay, I might be tending to reduce capacity in the low and traditional areas because eventually I'm not going to have those products. Okay, why would I want to keep a bunch of capacity around if I'm eventually not going to have those products? I might start selling that capacity and investing that money someplace else. Okay, if I'm a niche low end, it would be the opposite then, right? I might start reducing capacity in the high performance and size segments. So if I'm the competitor, I'm kind of looking, at least in the first round here, okay? By the second or third round, you should have a pretty good idea what your competitors are doing. You should be able to figure that out. Have a pretty good idea what their strategy is. At least one of the 2 strategies. Are they low cost or are they differentiator? Are you going to have it fine-tuned? Maybe not, but you should have a pretty good idea what your competitors are doing, what strategy they've chosen, and that's important. Okay, that's in my opinion, that's extremely important because that creates tactical opportunities, maybe, okay, depending on what the competitors are doing. So, okay. I want to look at the automation. I want to see what this does. So what should automation do? It should lower my labor cost, right? Okay. And so how come their labor cost is a little bit higher than other teams? Automation doesn't kick in until next round. Okay. Whoa. They bought it, right? Okay, they bought it in the first round, but I don't think it's going to kick in until next round. Okay. And And they also are using a little bit of overtime. They're the only team in the traditional segment that actually used a little bit of overtime. 17% of their second shift in that segment. And so that would tend to make it. That's why they're a little bit higher than the other teams right there, because they did use a little bit of overtime. Okay. I think next round you'll see that labor cost change. We'll have to see, right? And same thing up here. I think you'll see some labor costs up here then that are going to change. So keep this in mind too. Is it an expense to invest in automation, say, or capacity? Is that an expense? Strictly speaking, if I'm looking at the income statement, is that an expense? I got one person nodding their head. David's not real sure. How about you guys in between? I got one in the front and one in the back, and you're kind of one saying yeah, one saying sort of kind of. Is that an expense? How's it show up on the income statement? If I buy $10 million of automation, how does that show up on the income statement? Does it show up on the income statement? What's on the income statement? I got my revenue. I got my cost of goods sold. Is it a cost of goods sold? No. I got my operating expenses. That's things like indirect labor. That's things like my lights and my heating and some administrative costs, supplies, those types of things. Does it show up there? No, it doesn't. Okay, so now I'm down to, that gives me my net profit, my earnings before interest and taxes. Will it show up in my interest? It might. I missed one of the operating expenses where it might show up a little bit. Okay, and that's the depreciation. Okay, it'll show up just a little bit in the depreciation, like we saw with both Andrews and Erie, right? Okay, so when I invest $30 million, it shows up a little. It increased their depreciation. I'm going to scroll back up here. Sorry, but so their depreciation, they spent about $30 million, and Team Ferris spent nothing. Okay, so I can compare that. So Team Ferris has $7.6 million in depreciation, and Andrews has $9.4 million. Which one was the biggest, though? The biggest was Erie, and so they're 9.5. So it increased their. They spent $30 million. They invested $30 million. They increased their depreciation by $2 million. That's the only thing that shows up on the income statement, other than interest. And I don't know how much of that they had to borrow. I'd have to. We could pencil that out. I could probably go out and figure that out. But their interest is 1.3 million more. So they invested $30 million, and it did have a direct impact on their income, but only by $3 million, only by 10%. Really, when we purchase things like automation or capacity, we're just trading assets. We're just trading cash for something else. Okay? It's not an expense. Okay? And on the other hand, what does that do? Okay, so I said that it increased their depreciation and their interest by about $3 million, but what does it do otherwise? Ultimately, it's going to, in either case, it's going to reduce their HR expense, right? Their labor expense. Okay, automation is going to have a direct impact on that, and if you increase capacity, you use more first shift instead of second shift. Okay. And so it has a positive impact on that. And so the trade-off there, I mean, investing money early, because keep in mind too that automation, once you buy it, it's going to last you for 5 practice rounds, or next game it's going to last you for 8 competitive rounds. Okay? And it really doesn't have a big impact on your income statement. Obviously you're going to have to borrow you're going to have to raise the money to do that, and so it might have an impact on your leverage, it might have an impact on your working capital, it might create some risk, okay, but it also creates some payoff and payback. So, okay, when I'm reviewing things, I spend a decent amount of time looking at this particular deal, and I'll ask at the production, what's this called, the production analysis, yeah. And I ask a decent number of questions where the answers might kind of come from here, okay? Don't just look at your team. Look at every team and see what's going on, okay? Pricing. right? Pricing is a part of the deal, right? I want to see in the traditional segment, you know, where the other teams are at, 28, 28. Ooh, my computer team was 29 and a half, and they still sold quite a few. They didn't sell as many as the other teams, but they didn't make quite as many either. Okay, Erie at 26 bucks a share, they went low. Okay, they lowballed everybody, and it shows up in their sales. They still had some inventory there. Okay, and they're investing quite a bit in automation there. Ooh. Gets me thinking, right? Okay. MTBFs, it doesn't look like anybody changed MTBFs. Okay. Performance and size, I don't spend too much time looking at it here. The perceptual map that we're going to look at a little later gives me a pretty good idea where people are situated when it comes to that. The price I look at, as we go along, these material costs and labor costs, we're going to start seeing some differentiation there. First round, maybe not so much, again, because some of these investments aren't paying off yet. Okay. But as we go along, second round, you guys can make HR decisions. Okay. HR decisions will have an impact on productivity, recruitment, and things like that, okay, which might impact labor costs as well. Okay, so now HR investments, I do believe, are an expense, however. Okay, but again, it's an expense. You're gonna, geez, is it already time? Holy cow! Time flies by when you're having fun. I didn't even get through all of this. Okay.
Revision dates.
Revision dates are extremely important because that talks about when it revises. I like to look at the age and the revision date together. Every now and then you'll see a scenario where a team had higher sales of a certain product and you're kind of scratching your head and wondering why, because maybe the other buying criteria didn't quite match up. And you go back and you look at the revision date and their product revised in March and the other team's product didn't revise until December. And that can make a difference then on sales. Okay, it can. But there's other reasons to push your revision date out too, though. So it's not, that's one of those that, yeah, it's good to look at and kind of have an idea. Units and inventory, that's important because we need to know, you guys don't have a lot of inventory overall. Ferris has a lot in the performance category. If anything stung Ferris, it was in the performance category. They anticipated selling some more. They got a lot of product there, and they've got a lot of inventory there. Okay, that's primarily. In any of these other categories, I mean, you can just glance, and there's not a lot of inventory sitting out there. Okay, and so, but there's some. You know, the traditional segment obviously has some, and so you need to take that into consideration. Those become more important again too as we go on, as does the capacity in some of these. So start looking at those, and you know, they'll make more sense. And they'll be more important as the game goes on. So I better quit because I've used up your guys' time. Thursday I'll have an assignment ready for you, and we'll talk about that. We'll kind of finish going through this, but I'll also try to give you plenty of time on Thursday to get in your groups and talk about your round 2 decisions.